This morning, my 9-month pregnant wife asked me if I could build her a storage kind of cubby center for next to our refrigerator in her kitchen to store some of the baby's bottles and other stuff that we didn't have a great place for in our kitchen layout currently. So of course I said, no problem. I'm out here without any plans. All I've got is some basic exterior dimensions, and I'm just going to completely wing this project. I'm not going to lie to you guys. So hopefully it turns out awesome. If you're not already following, make sure to do that and hit the notification bell if you're on YouTube so you can get notified when we make content like this in the future. Let's get started. Because we wanted to tie in with our existing kitchen cabinetry, we're going to paint it the exact same color that we painted our kitchen cabinets in a project a few months ago. So this is going to be a mostly plywood construction with a 1/4-inch face frame, and we're going to paint the final product white. So that gives us a lot of versatility on what we can use. So we're going to use basic 3/4-inch maple plywood for the carcass, 3/4-inch shelves up and down, and we're going to put in some maple drawers with maple drawer fronts as well. So it's going to be a couple different cool aspects to this project, and we're going to start off with the exterior carcass. Per usual, I'm working with a fresh sheet of plywood. I like to start with my track saw to get one square edge and to break down this plywood into a little bit more manageable pieces before I head over to the table saw. So we're going to start by cleaning up this long edge. We're going to cut the back off at the sides, and then we'll go from there. Now that I've got my sides and my back cut to the proper width, I'm going to go ahead and cross cut. Again, cleaning up the plywood's factory edge, making sure that it's perfectly square to the cuts that I made with my track saw. Then I'm going to set up a stop block using my stop block system here at my miter saw to make sure that my sides and my back are the exact same height. And that's just a quick way to guarantee precision in your cuts. So we'll jump right into that. While I was cutting my sides and my back to length, I went ahead and cut a bottom piece and a top piece as well. And I'm going to use these two pieces as a support for my pocket hole jig. So for this project, I'm going to be using pocket hole joinery because I can hide the back joinery behind the cabinet, and I can hide the top and bottom joinery above and below the cabinet. So it makes perfect sense to utilize this joinery method for this project. And I'm going to go ahead and cut my joinery before I do my edge banding, just so to make sure I don't damage anything after I've got my edge banding all put together. But you can really do it in any order. I wanted to show you guys a simple jig that I use to make my edge banding because I'm making repetitive cuts at 1/4 of an inch. Instead of cutting a really thin rip with my fence really close to my blade, instead what I prefer to do is use this, which is literally a piece of wood cut to the width of my T-slot that I can stick in here. You want it to be as close to the fence locking position as you can if you have a Bisomer style fence like I have here, because it's going to make for a more accurate cut. And essentially I made this so that when I bring my fence over, touch off the board and lock it down, I now have a 1/4 inch rip. And when I run this board through, I can bring this back over, slide the next piece over, so as my board gets thinner, because I'm setting the distance off of this side, my rips are going to be the same size, and I don't have to look at my fence and move my fence over incrementally. And I also don't have to worry about cutting really thin rips and using something like a micro jig or a gripper from micro jig. So this is just a really cool way to not only get really accurate, consistent cuts, but to not have to make really thin rips between the fence and the blade. So it just lets you make much easier cuts. So again, this is literally just a piece of miter bar and a piece of plywood that I CA glued together. Then I screwed it together to give it some tension strength. And then I literally just sand the corner with the belt sander to get it nice and you know, I sand it incrementally with the belt sander, and that lets me get closer and closer to the 1/4 inch mark until I hit it dead on. So I mark that on my board, clamp this at exactly 1/4 inch, and I keep sanding this corner until it gets nice and tight. Pro tip, I also like to put CA glue on my corners right before I finish sanding, and that hardens the corner so that over time I don't wear that corner out by running boards across it. So the CA glue gives it basically just extra life points. So yeah, I'm going to make some 1/4 inch edge banding, and then we're going to glue that up to all of our plywood edges. Whenever I cut edge banding, I like to make sure I cut like 40 projects worth at once, because it's not really all that enjoyable to do. So I batch it out. Whenever I'm attaching edge banding, I use one of two approaches depending on whether I'm going to be painting or finishing, and also depending on how much volume of edge banding I have to do. So the easiest option is to just use a 23 gauge pin nailer. It works really well. You don't need a ton of clamping force to glue on edge banding, but you need a lot of consistency with clamping, which is why it's tricky to use conventional clamps unless you've got a ton of them. I like to use Titebond Quick and Thick for edge banding because it gives it extra strength as it's end grain, majority end grain glue up. Quick and Thick is a thicker glue that doesn't get sucked up as much into the pores and dries really fast, so I can move on to the next step even quicker. If I don't want to use a pin nailer for one of several reasons, but the main reason would be if I'm worried about the pin head showing, even though it's pretty unnoticeable, I still like to use bendy clamps from Rockler, which are spring clamps essentially that allow you to clamp edge banding. Based on the volume of this project, I'm going to use the pin nailer, and also because I'm going to be painting, so I'm not really worried about the pin, the metallic head of the pin showing. So yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and glue and pin these in place, and then once it dries, flush everything up and move on to the next part of the project. Now that I've let the glue dry on my edge banding, I'm going to go ahead and flush it up using sanding with a low grit. You use a random orbit sander and usually around 80 grit or 120 grit to sand it nice and flush. If I had made my edge banding a little bit oversized, so in this case I made it about a 64th of an inch oversized, so it was just perfect. But if I went a little bit wider, maybe a 16th or an 1/8 of an inch, I use a router, flush it up, and then I come back to get it sanded perfect. But in this case, I don't need to start with the router. I can jump right to sanding because it's just barely oversized. So I'm going to get to sanding. Now that I've flushed up and sanded all my edge banding and my panels, I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill my holes for my shelf pins that are going to be used on the upper half of this cabinet. So I talked to Nicole and we decided we're going to do 3 drawers on the lower section, and then the upper section is going to be 3 or 4 cubby shelves. So we're going to have shelf pin holes so we can be flexible with what we store in the cubbies. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill these so that once it's assembled I don't have to get inside the tight cubby space to drill out the holes. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Alright, well, dry fit looks good on everything, so I'm going to go ahead and glue and screw everything together and start the carcass assembly process. So hopefully this all goes according to plan. Like I said, we're winging it today, so we'll see. For the drawer fronts on this project, I decided to keep things simple, and I'm just going to go with solid maple drawer fronts. I put a nice little round over on the edges and corners, and I'm going to do a rabbited pull so there won't be any hardware on the front. These are going to get painted white, so it's going to be a nice clean modern look with the pulls kind of hidden away on the side. So super functional. Obviously with solid maple drawer fronts, it's going to be nice and durable, and just going to leave a nice clean look. So I'm going to get to sanding these up, and then I'm going to add the rabbited pulls here at the router table after I finish routing these, or sanding these. That'll be what we do next. Well, the project is finished and it's time to go ahead and move this into the kitchen. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think it's going to be really functional, and then being flexible with the shelving on the top is going to be super nice. Having two small drawers for things like silverware, plates, and then a big drawer at the bottom for things like baby bottles, bowls. It's going to be super functional for the babies and stuff in the kitchen, and I think it's going to match really well with our existing cabinetry. So it's going to look really cool and add a lot of functionality to basically a wasted space in our kitchen. So anyways, thank you guys for sticking around this long. I'd love to hear what you think about the design and the build in the comments. If you guys have any tips or anything you guys want to add to the design, let me know. And if you're not already doing so, make sure to follow and hit that notification bell if you're on YouTube so you can get notified when we make content like this in the future. Thanks a lot, guys. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we had a 9-month pregnant wife when we started this project, and well, needless to say, we had a little bit of an interruption.